"I promise I'll invite you, Mom. You'll be sitting right in the front row." Those were the words my daughter said to me 3 weeks before her wedding. The same afternoon she asked me for $50,000 like it was a simple favor, like it was something any mother could just hand over without a second thought. And I remember standing there in my small kitchen, the late afternoon sunlight coming through the blinds, catching the dust in the air, making everything look softer than it really was, and for a moment I didn't even hear the number. I just heard her voice. The way she said, "Mom," like she used to when she was a little girl asking for something she knew she probably shouldn't. And I told myself this was different, that this was her wedding, that this was important, that this was what I had saved for all those years without even knowing it. But something in that sentence stayed with me, something quiet and uncomfortable, like a loose thread I couldn't quite see but could feel every time I replayed her words in my head. "I promise I'll invite you, Mom." And I remember thinking, why would she say that? Why would my own daughter need to promise to invite me to her wedding? But I didn't ask, I didn't question it, because mothers like me, we learn not to question too much. We learn to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to give first and think later. And so I just smiled at her across the table, watching the way her fingers tapped lightly against her phone, the way her eyes didn't quite hold mine for more than a second, and I said, "Of course. Sweetheart, we'll figure it out." Even though I already knew there was no we in that sentence, there was only me and what I was about to give up. I had been living alone for 5 years at that point, ever since my husband passed, and I had learned how to make things stretch, how to turn a fixed income into something that felt like stability, how to convince myself that I didn't need much, just my little house, my morning coffee, the quiet hum of the refrigerator at night, and the occasional phone call from Emily when she remembered to check in. I didn't complain, I didn't ask for more. I told myself she was busy, that life moves faster for the young, that I had already had my time, and maybe that's why when she leaned forward that day, her voice soft, almost trembling, telling me how expensive everything had become, how Jason's family wasn't helping as much as they promised, how this wedding was supposed to be perfect, I didn't see manipulation, I saw stress, I saw my daughter overwhelmed, and I wanted to fix it the only way I knew how, by giving, by sacrificing. Quietly, by making sure she didn't have to carry that burden alone. She reached across the table and took my hand, and I noticed how cold her fingers felt, how quickly she squeezed and then let go, like the gesture was something she had practiced rather than felt. "You're the only one I can count on," she said, and that was the moment I stopped thinking entirely, because those words, they go straight to a mother's heart, they bypass logic, they erase hesitation, they make you forget every time you've been overlooked, every time you've been an afterthought, and replace it with one simple belief that you still matter, that you are still needed. And I held on to that feeling like it was something fragile, something I didn't want to examine too closely in case it broke, so I nodded, slowly at first, then more firmly, as if convincing myself as much as her. "Okay," I said. "I'll help you." And her face lit up instantly, too quickly, too brightly, like a switch had been flipped, and she stood up, coming around the table to hug me, her perfume unfamiliar, something expensive and sharp, and she whispered, "Thank you, Mom, I knew I could count on you." And for a brief second, standing there in my own kitchen, holding my daughter, I felt something that almost resembled happiness, but underneath it, buried just deep enough to ignore, was that same quiet question, the one I refused to say out loud. Why would she need to promise to invite me? And I let that question drift away, because it was easier to believe in her smile than to listen to that small, persistent voice telling me something wasn't right. And the next morning, I went to the bank and prepared to give her everything I had saved, every dollar that was supposed to carry me through the rest of my life, because that's what mothers do. We don't ask what we'll have left, we only think about what we can give. And at the time, I truly believed I was helping my daughter build the happiest day of her life. I remember the bank smelled faintly of polished wood and something sterile, like every other bank I had ever been in, but that morning it felt different, quieter somehow, as if even the air understood that what I was about to do mattered more than any transaction I had ever made before. And I stood in line with my purse clutched close to my side, the same purse I had carried for years, the leather worn soft at the edges, holding everything I considered important, my identification, a few old receipts, a photo of Emily from when she was about 8 years old, smiling with missing front teeth and holding a birthday cake I had made from scratch. And I found myself staring at that photo longer than I should have, because it was easier to look at who she had been than to think about who she was now. When it was finally my turn, the young man behind the counter greeted me with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and I told him what I needed, my voice steady even though my fingers tightened slightly around the strap of my purse. I explained that I wanted to transfer $50,000 to my daughter, And he paused for just a moment, the kind of pause that most people would not notice, but I did, because at my age you learn to read the smallest changes in people, the hesitation before a question, the shift in tone that suggests concern. He asked me if I was sure, not in a pushy way but gently, like he was offering me an opportunity to reconsider without making me feel foolish, and I smiled at him, the same polite smile I had used my entire life when I did not want to explain myself, and I said, yes, I am sure, it is for my daughter's wedding, and he nodded, typing slowly, carefully, as if giving me one last chance to change my mind, but I did not, because by then I had already convinced myself that this was what a good mother would do, that this was not loss, it was love, and love, I had always believed, was supposed to be given freely without keeping score. The process took a few minutes, longer than I expected, and during that time I noticed everything, the quiet clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of conversations, the way the sunlight came through the tall windows and reflected off the marble floor, making everything look almost too clean, too perfect, like a place where mistakes should not happen. When he finally printed the confirmation and slid it across the counter toward me, I looked down at the numbers, at the amount that had once represented years of careful saving, of saying no to things I wanted, of choosing practicality over comfort, and now it was just a line on a piece of paper, moving from my account to hers with a few keystrokes, just like that, and I signed where he indicated, my handwriting steady, deliberate, as if I wanted to leave no doubt that this was my decision, that no one had forced me, that I had chosen this. When I walked out of the bank, the air outside felt cooler than I expected, and I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting to the light, to the sound of cars passing by, to the normal rhythm of a world that had not changed even though mine had just shifted in a way I could not yet fully understand. I called Emily as soon as I got into my car, holding the phone close as it rang, and when she answered, her voice was bright, almost breathless, as if she had been waiting for this moment. I told her it was done, that the money was in her account, and there was a brief silence on the other end, just a second, but long enough for me to notice, before she responded with a rush of gratitude, thanking me over and over again, telling me how much this meant, how I had saved her, how everything was going to be perfect now, and I listened, letting her words wash over me, wanting to believe every one of them, wanting to feel that sense of purpose, that quiet pride that comes from knowing you have helped someone you love. But even as she spoke, there was something else. Something I could not quite name, a distance maybe, or a kind of carefulness in her tone, like she was saying exactly what needed to be said but nothing more. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time without starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, the confirmation receipt folded neatly beside me, and I told myself that everything would be fine, that weddings were stressful, that people acted differently under pressure, that once the day came and everything settled, things would go back to normal. She would call more, she would include me, she would remember that I was not just someone who helped from a distance but someone who belonged there, someone who should be part of that day, and I held on to that thought as I finally drove home, passing the same streets I had known for decades, the same houses, the same trees, everything familiar and unchanged, and yet something inside me felt slightly out of place, like I had stepped just a little bit outside of my own life without realizing it. That evening, I placed the receipt in a small box in my bedroom, the one where I kept important documents, insurance papers, old letters, things I might need someday. I smoothed it carefully, making sure it was flat, readable, preserved, not because I expected to need it, but because that was who I had always been, someone who kept records, someone who believed that details mattered, even when emotions tried to tell a different story. And as I closed the box and set it back in its place, I told myself again, quietly this time, that I had done the right thing, that everything else would follow, that a promise, especially from your own daughter, was something you could trust without question. In the days that followed, I told myself not to overthink things, that everything was moving the way it should, that weddings came with chaos and last-minute decisions and people forgetting to return calls, but the silence that settled in after that transfer was not the kind of silence that felt temporary. It was something slower, something that stretched longer each day, like a shadow that kept growing without anyone noticing. At first Emily still answered my calls, though they were shorter, more rushed, her voice always in the middle of something else, background noise I could not quite place, music sometimes, or voices, or the faint echo of a large room, and she would say things like, everything is coming together, Mom, you would love the venue, it is beautiful, and I would smile even though she could not see me, asking small questions, simple ones like what color are the flowers or how many guests are you expecting, and her answers were always just enough, never detailed, never inviting me into the picture the way I had imagined. It was like trying to look at something through a fogged window. You can see the shape of it, but not the details, and I began to notice how she never once mentioned sending an invitation, not once, and every time I thought about asking directly, something stopped me, a hesitation I could not explain, maybe pride, maybe fear of hearing something I was not ready to accept, so instead I waited, because waiting is something I had learned to do well over the years, waiting for phone calls, waiting for holidays, waiting for the moment when things would feel normal again. One evening I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, my phone lying face up beside me, and I found myself scrolling through old messages from Emily, reading them slowly, noticing how they had changed over time, how the warmth had faded, replaced by efficiency, by convenience, by responses that felt more like obligations than conversations. And I wondered when exactly that shift had happened, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, the way most important changes happen. And I thought back to the day at the bank, to the way she had said thank you, to the way her voice had lifted just a little too quickly. And for the first time I allowed myself to sit with that feeling instead of pushing it aside. It was not anger, not yet, it was something more uncertain, like standing at the edge of something you cannot see clearly, knowing there is a drop but not knowing how far it goes. The following week I tried calling her again, and this time it went straight to voicemail. I waited a few minutes and called again, same result, and I told myself she must be busy, maybe meeting with vendors, maybe finalizing details, and I left a message, keeping my tone light, telling her I just wanted to check in, to see how everything was going, to hear her voice. But as I ended the call, I realized how carefully I had chosen my words, avoiding anything that might sound like a question, anything that might require an answer she was not ready to give. Days passed like that, one after another, quiet, uneventful on the surface, but underneath there was a steady shift, a growing awareness that something was not right. I began to notice the absence of things, not just the invitation, but the lack of photos, the lack of excitement shared, the lack of inclusion in moments that should have naturally included me. I would open my mailbox each afternoon, sorting through bills and advertisements, pausing just a little longer than necessary before setting everything aside, as if the act of checking again might somehow change the outcome. And at night I would sit in my living room, the television on but barely heard, my attention drifting back to that one sentence, "I promise I will invite you, Mom." And I started to hear it differently, not as reassurance but as something else, something that now felt almost rehearsed, almost unnecessary, like a promise made not to be kept but to be remembered later. And one afternoon, without really planning to, I opened my laptop and searched for the venue she had mentioned in passing, scrolling through images, trying to picture her there, trying to imagine where I would sit, what I would wear, how it would feel to watch her walk down the aisle. And for a moment I allowed myself that image, that version of the future where everything made sense, where all of this waiting led to something meaningful. But then I closed the laptop slowly, because even that imagined moment felt distant, uncertain, like something that belonged more to a story I was telling myself than to reality. And as the days moved closer to a date I did not even know for certain, I found myself becoming quieter, more observant, less willing to fill in the gaps with hopeful explanations, because deep down, in a place I had tried very hard to ignore, I was beginning to understand that sometimes the absence of answers is the answer, and sometimes the things people do not say tell you more than anything they ever could. The morning I realized something had shifted for good did not feel dramatic. There was no sudden phone call, no message, no clear moment I could point to and say this is when everything changed. It was quieter than that, almost ordinary. I was standing by my mailbox again, the same way I had been every afternoon for the past 2 weeks, sorting through envelopes I already knew would not contain what I was looking for, bills, advertisements, a catalog I had never asked for, and I held each piece of mail a second longer than necessary, as if the weight of it might somehow reveal something I could not see. And when I finally closed the box, the sound of it clicking shut felt louder than it should have, sharp in the stillness of the afternoon, and I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the cool metal, thinking about how many times I had done this exact same motion, expecting a different outcome, expecting something to arrive that would make everything make sense, an invitation card, even a simple note, something that said you are part of this, you belong here, but there was nothing. And as I walked back inside, I noticed how quiet my house felt, not the peaceful kind of quiet I had grown used to over the years, but something heavier, something that pressed against the walls and settled into the corners of each room. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and paused, looking around at the space I had kept so carefully, everything in its place, everything familiar. And for the first time it felt like I was standing in someone else's life, like I had stepped slightly out of alignment with the world I thought I understood. Later that afternoon I tried calling Emily again, not because I expected her to answer, but because it felt like something I was supposed to do, like checking a door even when you already know it is locked. The phone rang once, then twice, then went straight to voicemail, and I did not leave a message this time. I simply ended the call and placed the phone back on the table because I was starting to understand that there are moments when silence is more honest than words, that sometimes continuing to reach out only gives the illusion that something is still there when it has already begun to disappear. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me, and let the quiet settle, not fighting it, not trying to fill it with explanations or excuses, just letting it exist. And in that stillness, memories began to surface, not the kind you actively recall, but the ones that come on their own, uninvited, assembling themselves into something clearer than before. I thought about past holidays, about the times plans had changed at the last minute, about the occasions when I had been told it would be easier if I stayed home, about the small disappointments I had brushed aside because they seemed too insignificant to question. Each one on its own had felt harmless, understandable even, but now lined up together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore, a quiet, consistent pattern of being moved just slightly to the side, never directly excluded but never fully included either. And I realized how easy it had been to accept that, how willing I had been to adjust, to make myself smaller, to fit into whatever space was left for me. And as that realization settled in, it did not bring anger the way I might have expected. It brought clarity, a kind of calm understanding that felt almost unfamiliar, because it did not ask me to react. It simply asked me to see things as they were, without softening them, without reshaping them into something more comfortable. And for the first time since that conversation in my kitchen, I allowed myself to revisit her words without filtering them through hope. "I promise I will invite you, Mom." And I heard it now not as reassurance but as something carefully placed, something that acknowledged the possibility of exclusion while pretending to eliminate it, a sentence that should never have needed to exist in the first place. And I felt something inside me shift, not break, not collapse, but adjust, like a weight being redistributed. And I stood up from the table, moving with a steadiness that surprised even me, walking to my bedroom, opening the small box where I kept my documents, and I took out the receipt from the bank, smoothing it between my fingers, looking at the numbers again, the date, the confirmation, all the details I had preserved without thinking I would ever need them. And I realized that while I had given without asking, I had not given without awareness, that somewhere, even then, I had known enough to keep a record, to leave a trace of what had happened. And as I placed the receipt back in its place, I understood something else, something quiet but certain, that whatever was coming next, whatever truth was still waiting just out of reach, I would not meet it with confusion or denial. I would meet it with the same calm attention I had given everything else, because sometimes the most important thing is not what people promise you, but what they actually show you when you are no longer looking away. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything finally came into focus, not all at once, but in the quiet, undeniable way that truth tends to arrive. I was sitting in my living room with my laptop open, not searching for anything in particular, just moving through the familiar routine of checking emails, glancing at headlines, letting time pass without asking too much from it, and then without thinking, I clicked on a social media page I had not visited in weeks, not because I was avoiding it, but because it had slowly become a place where I did not quite belong anymore. And as the page loaded, I saw it immediately, not buried, not hidden, but right there at the top, as if it had been waiting for me to see it, a photograph, bright and carefully composed, the kind people post when they want the world to see something perfect. Emily standing in a white dress, her hair styled in a way I had never seen before, her smile wide and effortless, the kind of smile that suggests everything is exactly as it should be. Beside her stood Jason, looking proud, confident, his hand resting lightly at her waist, and around them, people I recognized, friends, extended family, even a few faces I had not seen in years, all gathered together in what looked like a beautiful outdoor venue, sunlight catching the edges of everything, making the moment feel almost unreal. And I sat there, completely still, my hands resting on either side of the keyboard, not moving, not reacting, just looking. Because there are moments when your mind refuses to catch up with what your eyes are seeing, when the reality in front of you feels so distant from what you expected that it takes time for the two to align. I read the caption slowly, each word settling into place with a kind of quiet precision. The perfect day with the people who matter most. And I noticed the comments underneath, dozens of them, congratulations, admiration, little heart icons scattered across the screen. And I began to scroll, not quickly but carefully, taking in each image one by one, the ceremony, the reception, the small details that had clearly been planned with care, the flowers, the decorations, the tables arranged neatly, everything exactly as she had described. exactly as I had helped make possible. And yet, as I moved from one photo to the next, a single realization became impossible to ignore. I was not there, not in the background, not in a reflection, not even mentioned, and I did not need to search for myself to know that, because I would have remembered, I would have known, and I felt something inside me settle into place, not a sharp pain, not a sudden break, but a quiet, steady understanding that this was not a mistake. This was not something that had slipped through the cracks. This had been planned, decided, carried out with intention, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my gaze drift away from the screen for a moment, looking around the room as if expecting something to be different. But everything remained the same furniture, the same light coming through the window, the same stillness, and I realized that the only thing that had changed was my understanding. I looked back at the screen one last time, at her smile, at the people surrounding her, at the life she had built for herself, and I noticed something else, something smaller, almost insignificant on its own, but impossible to overlook now. In one of the photos, someone had tagged her, adding a comment that read, "So glad your mom could not make it. This looked like such an intimate day." And I read that sentence twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain that I had not misunderstood. And in that moment, everything that had been unclear before became unmistakably clear. This was not about timing, not about stress, not about things getting lost in the shuffle. This was a decision, one that had been made without hesitation, without consideration, and I felt my hands move slowly, deliberately, closing the laptop with a soft click that echoed slightly in the quiet room. And I sat there for a long time after that, not crying, not reaching for my phone, not reacting in any of the ways I might have expected, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to confirm. The truth had already presented itself in the most direct way possible, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel uncertain. I did not feel like I was standing at the edge of something I could not see. I was standing firmly on solid ground, looking at something exactly as it was, without illusion, without interpretation. And in that stillness, I understood that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what I would do with it, because a promise once broken this clearly does not ask for forgiveness. It reveals something far more important. It reveals exactly where you stand, and once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because there was something different in the air, something settled, something quiet and certain that had replaced the confusion that had filled my thoughts for weeks. And I lay there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, letting that feeling take shape, recognizing it for what it was: clarity, not the kind that comes with answers given to you, but the kind that forms when you stop asking questions that no longer need answers. I got out of bed slowly, moving through my morning routine the same way I always had, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light fill the room, but everything felt slightly sharper, more defined, like I was seeing my own life from a different angle. And as I sat at the kitchen table with my cup in front of me, I did not reach for my phone, I did not check for messages, because for the first time, I was not waiting for anything. I already knew what had happened, and more importantly, I understood what it meant. Later that morning, I walked into my bedroom and opened the small box again, the one I had placed so carefully back on the shelf just days before. And I took out the receipt, holding it between my fingers, looking at it not as a memory, not as something emotional, but as what it actually was: a record, a transaction, something concrete and undeniable. And I placed it on the table in front of me, smoothing it flat, aligning it with the edge of the surface, a small, deliberate action that felt more significant than it should have, because it was not just about the paper, it was about what I was choosing to see clearly now. I walked over to my desk and opened a drawer I had not touched in some time, pulling out a folder where I kept other documents, old tax records, bank statements, things I had always organized but rarely needed, and I began to add to it, not hurriedly, not emotionally, but methodically, gathering everything related to that transfer, every piece of information that connected to what had happened, not because I wanted to hold on to the past, but because I understood that details matter, that facts remain steady even when people do not. And as I worked, I noticed how calm I felt, not empty, not numb, but focused, like I had stepped into a version of myself I had not needed before, one that did not rely on trust alone, one that understood the value of awareness, of preparation, of seeing things fully instead of partially. At some point I paused, sitting back in my chair, looking at the papers in front of me, and I allowed myself to think about Emily again. Not the child in the photograph, not the version of her I had held on to for so long, but the person she had shown herself to be now. And I did not try to excuse it, I did not soften it, I simply acknowledged it, because there is a difference between holding on to someone and holding on to the truth about them, and I had spent enough time doing the former. It was time to accept the latter. My phone buzzed softly on the table beside me, and for a moment I glanced at it, not with expectation but with simple awareness, and when I picked it up I saw her name on the screen, a message, brief, casual. "Hey mom, sorry I have been busy, wedding was a lot, we will catch up soon." And I read it once, then again, noticing the absence of anything real, no mention of the fact that I had not been there, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a smooth continuation as if nothing required explanation, and I set the phone back down without responding, not out of anger, but because I understood that some silences say more than any reply could. I did not need to confront her, I did not need to demand answers because the situation had already answered itself, and instead I returned my attention to the papers in front of me, placing each one carefully into the folder, organizing them in a way that made sense, creating a structure where before there had only been trust, and as I closed the folder and set it aside, I felt something settle into place, a quiet decision, not loud, not dramatic but firm, because while I had given freely, I had not given blindly, and now that I had seen everything clearly, I knew that what came next would not be shaped by promises, it would be shaped by what I had learned to recognize, by what I had chosen to keep track of, and by the understanding that sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate, it is prepared, patient, and rooted in the simple act of no longer ignoring what has been right in front of you all along. That afternoon I drove across town without telling anyone where I was going, not because I was hiding anything, but because this was something I needed to do quietly, without explanation, without interruption, and as I pulled into the parking lot of the small law office I had looked up earlier that morning, I sat in my car for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not nervous, not uncertain, just aware of the fact that I was stepping into something new, something that required a different kind of strength than I had been using all these years. The building itself was unremarkable. A simple brick structure with a glass door and a modest sign. Nothing about it suggested drama or conflict, and that felt appropriate, because what I was doing was not about creating a scene, it was about understanding my position, about seeing clearly what options existed beyond the emotional ones I had relied on for so long. Inside, the office was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from people working with focus rather than urgency, and when I introduced myself at the front desk, my voice steady, the receptionist greeted me with a polite warmth that did not ask questions it did not need to ask. I had scheduled the appointment under a general consultation, not specifying details, because I wanted to hear things explained from the ground up, without assumptions, without influence. When I was shown into the office, the attorney, a man in his early 50s with a calm, attentive manner, gestured for me to sit, and I placed my folder on the desk in front of me, not opening it right away, but letting it sit there visible, a quiet acknowledgement that this conversation would be based on facts, not feelings. He asked how he could help, and I took a breath, choosing my words carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. I explained that I had transferred a significant amount of money to my daughter under the understanding that it was for a specific purpose, and that circumstances surrounding that situation had raised concerns. I did not raise my voice, I did not express anger. I simply laid out what had happened in the same measured way I had begun to approach everything else. And as I spoke, I noticed how different it felt to describe the situation without softening it, without protecting it, just stating it as it was. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a question to clarify a detail, and when I finished there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful, and then he began to explain, not in complicated terms, but in a way that made everything accessible, understandable. He spoke about intent, about documentation, about how certain transactions could be interpreted depending on the circumstances and the evidence available, and as he talked I found myself focusing on the structure of what he was saying, the way each piece connected to the next, forming a clear path where before there had only been uncertainty. He asked if I had any records, and I opened the folder, sliding the documents across the desk, the receipt, the statements, everything I had carefully gathered, and he reviewed them with a quiet attention that felt almost reassuring, not because it promised a specific outcome, but because it confirmed that what I had done mattered, that keeping those details had not been unnecessary, that awareness had its place. After a few minutes, he looked up and met my eyes, and in that moment, I understood something without him needing to say it directly, that I was not powerless in this situation, that what had happened was not simply something I had to accept without question, and he explained the possible paths forward, the considerations, the way these matters could be approached, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with intention, with clarity, and I listened, not rushing, not interrupting, just taking it in, because this was not about reacting, it was about choosing. When the meeting ended, I gathered my folder, thanking him, and as I walked back out into the afternoon light, I felt a kind of steadiness that had not been there before, not because anything had been resolved yet, but because I had moved from uncertainty into understanding. And as I got back into my car, I did not reach for my phone, I did not feel the need to check for messages or explanations, because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for someone else to define what this situation meant, I was beginning to define it for myself, and as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, merging back into the quiet flow of traffic, I realized that everything that had happened up to this point had led me here, not to a place of confrontation, but to a place of clarity, and that from here on, whatever came next would not be guided by promises that had already proven empty, but by something far more reliable, something I had almost forgotten how to trust, my own understanding of what is right, and my willingness to act on it without hesitation. That evening, I returned home with a quiet determination that had settled over me like a familiar coat, not heavy, not suffocating, but reassuring in its presence, and as I stepped inside, I noticed the familiar smell of brewed coffee lingering in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the evening light casting long shadows across the living room floor. Everything exactly as it should be, ordinary and predictable, yet my perspective had shifted, the ordinary now carrying a weight I could feel in my chest, not a weight of sorrow but of clarity, a recognition of the space I occupied and the decisions I had made. I set my keys down on the counter and walked slowly to the dining table, sitting in the same chair I had used countless times, my hands resting lightly on the smooth wood surface, my mind reviewing the events of the past weeks, the transfer of money, the days of silence, the quiet realization that the wedding had taken place without me, the details revealed through images and comments online, and I allowed myself to acknowledge all of it without judgment, without panic, simply seeing what had happened and what it represented. I reached for my folder, the one containing every document, every receipt, every note I had kept since that afternoon at the bank, and I opened it carefully, sorting through each piece with deliberate attention, not because I needed to relive the situation, but because I needed to be fully aware, to understand the totality of what had occurred, every dollar accounted for, every transfer traced, every confirmation printed. And as I organized the papers, I felt a sense of control returning to me, the kind of control that comes not from power over others, but from power over your own understanding, from knowing precisely where you stand and what you have at your disposal. After arranging everything neatly, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting a warm, soft light across the room, and in that quiet moment, I thought about Emily, about the life she had built, about the wedding she had celebrated, about the absence of an invitation, the absence of acknowledgement, and I felt no anger, only the clear knowledge of reality, the understanding that intentions and promises are not always aligned with actions. I closed the folder and set it aside, allowing the feeling of clarity to settle deeper, and I realized that from this point forward, any engagement I chose to have would be grounded not in assumptions or hope, but in the facts I had established, the documentation I had preserved, the observations I had made. And with that understanding came a calm confidence, a quiet readiness to respond appropriately should the need arise, not in haste, not in dramatics, but with measured, deliberate awareness. And I moved to my bookshelf, pulling down a notebook I had kept for personal reflections, opening it to a fresh page, and began to write, detailing the events, the dates, the conversations, the observations, not as a record of grievance, but as a record of clarity, a way to ensure that my perception was accurate and grounded, that nothing could distort what I had seen and learned. And as I wrote, I felt a sense of peace settling in, not the fleeting peace of denial or avoidance, but the enduring peace of recognition and preparation, knowing that I had seen clearly, had acted deliberately, and would continue to do so. And as the evening light faded and the first stars appeared in the sky outside my window, I closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks, allowed myself to sit quietly without expectation, without urgency, simply being present in the space I had claimed through awareness, through careful observation, through deliberate attention to the facts. And in that stillness, I understood that clarity is not always loud or dramatic, but it is always steady, reliable, and the foundation from which all future actions can be thoughtfully and confidently taken. That night, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a gentle circle of light across the table where I had placed my notes and documents, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to reflect on everything I had learned, everything I had observed, and everything I had confirmed through careful attention. I traced the events in my mind, starting from the moment Emily had asked for the money, to the days of minimal contact, to the discovery of her wedding photographs online, and then to the meticulous records I had gathered, each step forming a clear line from action to consequence. And in that reflection, I realized that what I had been holding on to all along was not just frustration or disappointment, but clarity, a clear picture of intention, absence, and result, and I understood that I could respond with insight rather than impulse, that I could act with purpose rather than emotion, because seeing clearly gives you control, and control is far more powerful than any fleeting anger or regret. I picked up my notebook again, turning the pages to mark a fresh section, and I began to write, documenting the timeline, the transfers, the communications, and the lack thereof, noting carefully how each element fit together, how each piece built on the last, creating a full account of reality rather than the story I had hoped to see. And as I wrote, I felt a sense of steadiness, a calm certainty that comes from knowing that you have observed accurately and completely, that you have not ignored what was in front of you, that you have taken responsibility for your understanding. And in that moment, I realized that this was my power, the quiet power of awareness, the steady strength that does not need to raise its voice to be effective. I paused and looked around the room, noticing the small details that had previously gone unnoticed, the way the shadows moved across the walls, the faint sound of the refrigerator humming, the slight creak of the floor as the house settled, and I understood that all of this, the ordinary, the familiar, the quiet, was now framed by what I had learned, giving it new meaning later. I went to my desk and began organizing the materials into a comprehensive file, separating receipts from statements, marking observations, keeping everything accessible, not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a record of clarity, a foundation for future decisions. And I found myself thinking about the concept of trust, about how promises can be made lightly, how words can suggest intentions that actions do not support, and how, in the end, it is not what people say that defines the reality you live in, but what they show you through their choices. As I continued working, the quiet presence of the house felt supportive rather than empty. I was no longer waiting, no longer hoping, but simply aware. And that awareness felt like a gift, a tool, something I could use to move forward. Deliberately, I reviewed the events again in my mind, considering next steps, considering how to protect myself while maintaining my composure, how to act when necessary without being hasty, and I realized that preparation, knowledge, and calm observation were more effective than confrontation or complaint. Finally, I closed the notebook and set it aside, feeling the weight of the week lift slightly, a lightness in knowing that I had acted appropriately at each point, that I had seen clearly and recorded faithfully. And as I stood stretching slightly, looking out the window at the darkened sky, I understood that this process, this careful collection of information, this steady observation, had not just revealed the truth about a single event, but had reminded me of the strength that comes from patience, the power in seeing things as they are, and the confidence that accompanies the ability to act when you understand completely. And in that moment, I felt not relief in the usual sense, but the steady, enduring satisfaction of clarity, of preparedness, and of knowing that no matter what came next, I was equipped to face it with calm, precise awareness and unwavering composure.